Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second panel of the day, Water Justice Part 1. My name is Kate Ostrom, and I am your chair for today's panel. I am a recent graduate in Latin American literature and the environmental humanities from Wayne State University in Detroit, and my current book project looks at the U.S.-Mexico border crisis from an environmental perspective, including border rivers such as the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, Santa Cruz, and San Pedro in Arizona, and Sonora. I present on June 2nd. Each presentation today will run 15 minutes, and we will save all questions for presenters until the very end, when we will have 20 full minutes dedicated to discussion. Feel free to put your questions into the chat as well, and I can ask these on your behalf if you would prefer. First up, we have Professor Shalini Puri, Drawing on Water, Matter, Models, and Metaphors for Freshwater Justice. Shalini Puri is professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh, where she works on post-colonial and cultural studies of the Global South with a focus on the Caribbean. Her research spans memory studies, environmental humanities, feminism, social movements, nationalism, indentureship and slavery fieldwork, the arts, and everyday cultural practices. Her publications include the award-winning The Caribbean Post-Colonial, as well as The Grenada Revolution in the Caribbean Present, Operation Urgent Memory, Caribbean Military Encounters, co-edited with Laura Putnam, and Theorizing Fieldwork in the Humanities, co-edited with Deborah Castillo. She edits Palgrave Macmillan's series New Caribbean Studies. She also co-founded the Pitt Prison Education Project. Her book in progress is entitled Poetics for Freshwater Justice, Postcards of the Caribbean Anthropocene. A recent article from that project entitled Postcards Remixed, I practice this word, Preface, Ecology and the Everyday in Caribbean Postcard Poetry, you can correct me, appeared in a 2023 special issue of Journal of West Indian Literature on Caribbean Literature, Art, and Environmental Activism. In the last few years, she has given keynote and invited lectures in the Caribbean, India, England, and the USA on the topic of freshwater justice. Please warmly welcome Shalini.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Great. Thank you. All right. Right. All right. Well, thank you. Good morning. Thanks to Julia and Sam for organizing this sustained conversation over several weeks now. Give me one more second. I am unable to see myself or anybody else. What did I just do? I see. Okay, I think I got it. Okay, so I'm really looking forward to the exchange and collaborations over the next few weeks. Thank you so much for setting it up. The context for my work is Caribbean literary studies and environmental humanities, where perhaps not surprisingly, given that the Caribbean is an archipelago, the focus in the arts and humanities has been on oceans. So there exists a rich and substantial body of theoretical and creative work on Black Atlantic, the Caribbean Sea, critical ocean studies, and a very moving kind of poetics of the Middle Passage, of Black shoals, Jahaji Bhai, or ship brothers, ship siblings, the hold, wake work, mangrove, corals. But the poetics around Caribbean freshwater, especially around, especially outside of discrete disaster events, and especially in the arts and humanities, is much less elaborated. Representations of freshwater justice, even less so. And so it's that kind of poetics that I'm trying to locate, assemble, and remix through a study of poetry and visual art. Elsewhere in the project, I've worked on small clay vessels in which people carried or distributed water, and on water infrastructures from pipes and standpipes to canals and dams. But today I want to think together about groundwater and ask your help about how we might better imaginatively grasp and represent groundwater, which, unlike the expansive oceans, is by definition invisible. I believe scholarly and institutional orientations towards large scales and to sight as the dominant sense contribute to groundwater's underrepresentation. If and when it is represented, it tends to be the moment that it comes to the surface, right? Spring, well, standpipe, or you might see the absence of groundwater, the visualization of drought that could take form through a metaphorics of acacia, its thorny shade, a rebuttal of postcard palms. So a rare exception is this poem by Olive Senior, Yemoja, Mother of Waters. But overall, we have a scant poetic vocabulary for thinking about groundwater or the urgent problem of its depletion. So between 1960 and 2000, worldwide groundwater depletion more than doubled, contributing to both sea level rise and a reduction in available groundwater. The rate and scale of extraction has changed the very tilt of the Earth's axis. That change is a planetary ledger of human thirst. How to imagine this planetary tilt, this wobble and drift, how to imaginatively grasp each daily act of extraction, irrigating a paddy field, bottling Coca-Cola, purifying water, pumping water to cook or bathe, how to imagine these as also infinitesimal unbalancings of the planet. How does one track the scant literary references to groundwater across texts and read them intertextually? What archive might thereby coalesce? What senses other than sight do we need to cultivate to better live with groundwater? And how might thinking with or like groundwater change our models, metaphors, and measures of resistance to water injustice? 84% of Jamaica's water comes from groundwater, much of it from cockpit country. There are many ways to tell cockpit country's story: its verdant forests and undulating hills, its landscapes, karst landscapes with undulations created by the dissolution of soft soluble rock, a limestone landscape characterized by sinkholes, caves, underground rivers, as well as streams that surface and disappear. And interestingly, karst comes from kras, a Slovenian word that means rocky, stony, infertile, suggesting a dry or waterless place, despite the fact that 40% of Jamaica's fresh water is sourced from cockpit country. So the limitation is invisible surface water, but there is abundant rainfall and abundant invisible groundwater. So cockpit country, its story is 12 million years in the making. The name of that story was given by the British in the First Maroon War. And it is also the site of maroon habitation and intense maroon resistance to this day. Cockpit country proposed since the 60s and 70s as World Heritage Site and National Park. But now, since 2004, Jamaica, which had been one of the world's largest producers of bauxite in the 60s, opened cockpit country to bauxite mining, gouging the landscape and releasing toxic runoff and mud lakes into the groundwater. As a result of decades of struggle to save cockpit country, its air and water, it was declared a conservation area. But the boundaries of the protected area of cockpit country remain disputed. So here it's only the yellow part that they have agreed on as protected, that is, the government has agreed on as protected, whereas the residents consider the green parts also as part of the conservation zone. Moreover, you can see how the boundaries are semi-encircled by mining, which is shown in orange. Yet groundwater and the pollutants it carries do not observe those boundaries. So how does groundwater figure in the eco-poetics of cockpit country and in anti-bauxite mining struggles in Jamaica? Here are excerpts from Olive Senior's poem, Cockpit Country Dreams. Notice how the poem draws on senses other than sight, For example, in the column on the right, it says, "My father said, lines on paper cannot deny something that is." And she's pointing there to an underlying reality of different fluid changing connections rather than those firm borders, the connections that are violated by a sacrifice zone that encircles and contains the conservation zone. The poem then goes on to hold up as a model the value of invisibility. So it's not a question of, we can't see it, let's correct that by seeing it. The road is mapped and takes people there, but our river, undocumented, was mystery. Note also the road, but our river, and elsewhere in the poem, the river, this river, evoking contestations over belonging, specificity, and affiliation. Elsewhere, the poem activates the rhyme or sound connection between the unseen mystery and history and ancestry. So the poem's method is not simply to find a way to visualize groundwater. Rather, the method is to claim the value of opacity as a means of evading capture, escaping the channeling of water and all else into unfriendly hands, an invisibility the Maroons knew well and learned from. It's also an invitation to cultivate other senses, sound in particular. In Senior's poem, the bird sounds a note. The father and mother both say, "Listen, child," possibly a familiar parental injunction, but as the poem proceeds, it seems to suggest that she listened to the rivers. So look at that last line, "Listen, child, study rivers, learn everything." So I want to place this alongside an excerpt from another poem that mobilizes sound, Midsummer Rain by Jeff Phelps. Veins of bauxite, syllables, seep through rock and time. First, there's a real ambiguity here as to who or what utters the syllables, not just poet, but perhaps bauxite or perhaps water itself. But at any rate, we hear the susurrance of syllables seeping. We're asked to listen for them, perhaps to the sound of the drip or trickle. And if time permits later, I'd love to say something about Isis Simaj Hall's sound video called Hinterland Dub and how it works with echo and so on. But both poems also point us to different conceptions and scales of time. Syllables seep through rock and time recalls Olive Senior's "The hours form slowly like stalagmites." One scale is quotidian, the sound of the bird's note, daily, repetitive, the time of human and animal events, of drinking water, of surviving scarcity, of extraction and profit, resistance and revolution. The other is geological. Senior references planetary time. The world turns and turns, returning us to the tilting, drifting axis of the planet with which I began. Cockpit country, 12 million years in the making, near instantaneous in the destruction. Yemoja, mothers of waters, salt water, rainwater, groundwater. The circle comes round, yes, but it's a different circle from a human clock. These poems then attune us to slow violence, slow hope, slow healing, slow arts. And I'm quoting here Nixon, Mauk, Mika, Power. They urge us to consider where the small, slow, and unseen should fit in the scales of justice, also in the scales of geopolitics, funding priorities, and the Anthropocene itself. Groundwater calls for and enables this different kind of attention, a different sensory attunement to the unseen. It shifts our models of resistance away from the event-driven crisis, disaster, riot, revolution, to the drip and seep of ordinary quotidian life and geological time alike. So what if our metaphors for resistance, our measures of significance shift from flood, burst, wave, surge, tide, to drip, leak, seep, to quiet accumulations and fugitive flows. Constant dropping better than heavy shower. A persistent drizzle is better than a downpour, for the earth can better absorb it. Perhaps it is the refusal of enticements of scale, a decision to shift our orientation toward the slow and quiet, the insistent drip and seep that might replenish the aquifers of our ecological imaginations. To close, then, the phrase "drawing on water" in my title is an effort to acknowledge the ways in which we rely on water both materially and conceptually. The title phrase draws together ideas of drawing as representation, extraction, infrastructure, labor, forms of relationality, and impermanence. The sea is history, Derek Walcott famously wrote, but more quietly and less visibly, so is groundwater.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shalini. That was beautiful. So inspired. Okay, next we move to Thijs van den Houdt with Performing Water Stories. Thijs van den Houdt is a doctoral researcher specializing in live journalism within journalism education. In preparation for his professional doctorate, he organized 2 boot camps where journalism and theater students collaborated on theatrical productions exploring current topics such as water authority elections and the role of ketamine as a recreational drug in Dutch society. During the 2023 Live Journalism Festival in Toronto, van den Houdt performed alongside colleagues from both Tilburg and Berlin in a production of their own making. In addition to his research, van den Houdt teaches ethics and public debate at Fontys School of Journalism. He earned his master's degree in philosophy of contemporary challenges with a thesis on the influence of modern, particularly social media, on the public sphere. This expertise informs his teaching and drives his research into live journalism. By integrating theatrical methods into journalistic practices, he aims to foster more sustainable and meaningful connections within audiences. Van den Houdt is currently developing a live journalism curriculum at Fontys, which joined the Global Live Journalism Network in 2023. Please join me in welcoming Thijs.
Thank you so much, Kate. I hope you'll forgive my subpar PowerPoint skills. I'll keep my presentation brief, but first I think I owe you a little bit of an explanation about what a PD really is, because I'm a doctoral researcher, but I'm not doing a PhD. So a PhD is much like a PD is much like a PhD, but it's placed more in society. So I work together with media companies in the Netherlands and also all of the journalism schools that we have in order to kind of boast a new conversation between audiences and journalism schools, and then learning from that. So it's very much practical design research. So I'm doing my PhD research in live journalism curricula for the journalism schools in the Netherlands. Live journalism really is journalism employing an artistic methodology. Whereas you think of a journalist taking an interview with a pen and a paper and then writing an article for a newspaper, that's not entirely what we do. We employ different methods, such as embodiment exercises with our sources, and our productional output could very well be a theatrical play. And I think while doing live journalism, you take a much closer proximity to the topic that you're researching. I think many people, if you ask them what is good journalism, they will use the word objectivity in their first or second sentence of their answer. We try to lean into the opposite of that. We try to lean into subjectivity, not so much as sharing the opinion of the journalist, but to let the journalists subject themselves to a story, much like a restaurant critic would. So you let the story run through you, as it were. And a few years ago, we did a boot camp, a live journalism boot camp, together with the Faculty of Theatre in Tilburg, and it resulted in performing water stories. Because in the Netherlands, I don't know how many of you yet, how many of you know, we have elections for how water should be managed. And we had these water elections coming up. So not for a prime minister or for a municipality, but for the way that water needs to be managed. What do we do when there's a drought? What do we do when it rains too much? And what do we do to have farmers be able to grow their crops? Maybe you'll understand that our students do not think this is the most sexy of topics to work with on a journalistic level. So what we also saw is that both media outlets and the public, as a result, really overlook this type of elections, the water elections. And what we need is a new relation, not just with water elections, but with water as a whole. So we had the idea of organizing this boot camp, and it all started with, let's see if I can get, oh yeah, it's working. It all started with hosting a water tasting. So we had a group of students submit for this program, and I asked them all for the first meeting to bring a bottle of tap water from their homes to school in order for us to do a water tasting together. Many of them thought it was a practical joke. It wasn't, because we started tasting these different waters from different cities, or even the same cities but different regions in the city. And there was such a variety of nuance and even color sometimes. There was a variety in aftertaste, in mouthfeel. It was extraordinary. And I think by doing that water tasting, our students learned that there is a complexity to water as a product. It seems self-evident, but it's not. When water is never just water. It has a life, it has a history and a future. And that made them curious. So we took them to a beautiful garden in the city of Utrecht, where there was a crowdsourced exhibition. And for this exhibition, people from the public had collected these little glass vials of water, and they would submit them there. Some had spat in that water. Some had collected their bath water after taking a bath. Some had taken it from the sea or a local lake. So we had this huge variety of types of water. You can see them here. And all of this was not to get familiar with the concept of a water election, but just to first get familiar with the concept of water and the role that it plays in our society. And with that curiosity, we gave them 2 or 3 weeks to do research. We let it go. We did not want to control their research questions too much. We let them loose. And when they returned for the boot camp, we saw these great new ideas. At the boot camp, which was, again, a collaboration between the journalism students and the students of the Master of the Theatre Academy here in Tilburg. And what we asked them to do is take 5 days and build a journalistic theatre performance, whatever form it may take. It could be an installation in public space. It could be a theatre play. It could be a musical, whatever you want. It could be a game. And I would like to share 3 of their stories with you. We had one group, they were fascinated by water as a cultural phenomenon, because they found online that there are all these water gods from different religions from everywhere in the world. And they researched these gods, their stories, and how the culture around it responds to those gods. And what they did is host a little pilgrimage in the garden of the theater school. So we had a pilgrimage, and we all followed one of the water gods. And they made it open so that everyone had the opportunity to thank the water god in the way they thought fit, and to not make it into a caricature. But it was already such a different relation to water, to try to look at water as a cultural phenomenon through the eyes of someone that is not Dutch, someone that has a different religion. A second story that they came up with was the game. So every city in the Netherlands, or every municipality even, have their own water board. So what we have the elections for are very local, which means that different cities have different interests and different opinions on how to deal with water shortage, but also with too much rain. So they came up with a game. We were all divided into cities, and then we got a list of demands from that city, from that water municipality. And we got also 1 cup of water, and we had to divide it over all the tasks of the water board. And what we came up with was a completely different picture of what should we do with water than the actual case. So this is a different way, again, to interact with the concept of water, and a different way of getting to know the water board elections. And the third one of my favorites actually, was a restaurant that they came up with. Because in their research, they found that many people have this very simplistic way of thinking about water and how it should be managed. And it comes down to, when it rains and you have too much water, you store it. And then when there's a drought, you use it. But that is not how water management works. They had interviews with people from the water boards who kept telling them, that's what people think we can do, but that's not what we can do. And they liked this oversimplistic way of thinking, and they wanted to put it into a concept, a restaurant concept. They named the restaurant Droplets, and Droplets only serves water. So in the picture on the left, you see students and a few teachers sitting at a table, a very long table. And at the restaurant of Droplets, you cannot move your own dishes. They're fixed to the table. And Droplets only serves water at one side of the table. So you would have people with buckets of water at one side of the table, and they would have to like make a cup with their hand and try to get the water to the other side of the table. You can't. One side of the table was completely wet with water, while the other side never really saw one drop of water. So the redistribution of water, when you have too much or too little of it, isn't as simple as you might think. Then we had an evaluation after the boot camp with the students, and I think the most interesting stuff came out of that. One student, it's the girl sitting on the left, she told me that doing live journalism in this way had led to a completely different body of knowledge. She felt compelled, really, to look at the topic in a more 3D way. Because there was this moment during the boot camp that she had to play a farmer. And when she had to do that, she brought to school overalls and like one of those straws of grass that are very cartoony when you think of a farmer. And she took place in a theatrical setting, and she assumed the role of a farmer. And then someone else said, I don't think a farmer would go to a professional meeting wearing overalls and with a straw of grass. And she said, oh my God, that is my preconception. And I think that is what journalism, live journalism is all about. It's re-evaluating your way of working as a journalist and coming into contact with that preconception that you have, and then laughing about it, but also leaving it behind in order to have an actual better portrayal of someone that you are trying to put on stage. And this is a theme that I see now with students that are doing live journalism. This is my final example, because I have a new group of graduate students, and they are working on a story about people having romantic relationships with AI. And the same thing happened here. Because they interviewed a few people that have a romantic relationship with AI. And when they tried to put it on a stage, they bought a mannequin. And after a few rehearsals, someone said, yeah, I don't know if the mannequin is doing it, because now there's just someone talking to a mannequin, and it makes the person on the other side look like an idiot and also like a victim. But these people don't feel like victims, and they're very well capable of having a life or even a relationship next to it. And that, again, is what live journalism is about. It's coming into contact with the things you thought were a good idea, and the ways of portrayal of sources that you thought were neutral or were a good representation, but they turned out not to be, which I think is a beautiful way of restructuring the relationship between audiences and journalism. That's all for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thijs. That was, I'm still thinking through everything. It's amazing. Okay, everyone, next we have Yahya, Sefa, Ekinci, who will discuss contested currents, water, and power in contemporary film. Yahya, Sefa, Ekinci works as a research assistant at Istanbul Bilgi University and contributes to academic research and education in the media department. He is also an MA student in communication studies at Kadir Has University, Istanbul. He earned his BA in film and television from Istanbul Bilgi University, where he graduated with high honors and a full scholarship. His research interests include film language, political aesthetics of cinema, global South cinema, and experimental and avant-garde cinema. Please warmly offer a welcome to Yahya.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. I am Yahya Sefa Ekinci from Istanbul Bilgi University, and today I will be talking about water and power in contemporary Turkish cinema. Let me do this. Okay. Actually, I should say water and power in contemporary Turkish film rather than contemporary film, because my project focuses on specifically on films from Turkey. What first drove me to this topic was noticing how in many political films I have watched in recent years, water consistently plays a significant role. Whether small or central, it's never irrelevant. To understand this, I had to start exploring the link between water and power. This took me to classical theorists, especially Karl Marx, whose writings frame water as a site of class conflict and capitalist contradiction. Capitalists turn water into a public good, a capitalist turn water a public good into private wealth, creating inequality and conflict. Through alienation, water becomes an external, commodified object, something we must buy, not something freely available. Michel Foucault, Expand on Marx, offers a powerful way to think about modern water governance. Two key concepts, real power and governmentality, are especially relevant here. Water, vital to life and public health, becomes a tool of political control. Decisions about access, quality, and distribution are not just technical. They are exercises of power that shape life itself. Governmentality, blending government and rationality, shows how modern power shapes behavior not only through rules but encouraging self-regulation. In water politics, this means promoting individuals as responsible water stewards, aligning personal conduct with state-defined goals. Both Marx and Foucault are essential to understanding how water fits into power relations, but in both, water is still portrayed as passive, something to be governed, not something with agency. In recent years, newer theories have challenged the traditional one-sided view of water as a merely passive or government. These approaches, especially hydro-humanities, reimagine water as an active, shaping force in culture, politics, and imagination. Rather than treating water as a backdrop, hydro-humanities focused on how water appears in literature, art, film, and historical narratives, not just as a substance, but as symbol and site of power. Water is ecological, cultural, political advance. It flows through ecosystems, meaning, and economies. A river or a pipeline isn't just a structure. It's a part of symbolic world and a contested resource shaped by access, cost, and control. Importantly, these layers are intertwined with power struggles. Controlling water has long serviced states, empires, but water also resists control. It floats, dries up, changes courses. Political ecologists emphasize this duality. Water is shaped by governance and capitalism, but its material force, floods, droughts, rhythms, can disrupt human control and spark new responses. So water is just not something we manage. It's an active, unpredictable player in political life. So, as water itself, cinema is a battleground for power relations as well. Cinema operates within ideological structures. According to Althusser and Jameson, all films, regardless of intent, are shaped by and reproduce dominant ideologies. The idea of a natural or apolitical cinema itself is ideological. Resistance in the cinema only possible, not only but possible through form and content. Some films disrupt ideological norms by altering cinematic form and narratives. Before talking about the Turkish cinema and water and power, I want to give a brief history of Turkey in terms of medical, corps, military corps. Turkey experienced two military corps. One of them is in the 60s, one of them in the 80s. Dry Summer, produced in 1963, directed by Metin Erksan, emerged in the wake of 1960 military coup and the relatively progressive 1961 constitution. This brief moment of political openness allowed filmmakers to confront social inequalities more directly, paving the way for a new political cinema. Erksan's films exemplifies this shift by exploring conflict around water ownership as a metaphor for a larger question of power, justice, and resistance. Dry Summer follows Erkan's earlier exploration of land ownership in Revenge of the Snakes and turns that focus to water. The act of damming a spring is framed not just as a social injustice, but as a violence against Earth, which villagers declare as water is Earth's blood in protest. The film culminates a powerful symbolic moment where water itself enacts revenge by flooding the fields and destroying the dam. Nature becomes an agent of justice, challenging the human-centered logic of control. Importantly, the film also critiques the failure of the legal system. Although local authorities initially intervened to enforce water sharing, legal loopholes ultimately allow the wealthy landowner to reassert control, highlighting how law bends to privilege. Dry Summer also resonates beyond national borders. It won the Golden Bear at 1964 Berlin Film Festival, marking one of the earliest international recognitions of Turkish cinema. This accolade highlights the film's alignment with the global wave of politically engaged filmmaking in the 1960s, a moment when Marxist theory, the colonial movements, and materialist critiques of power gained ground across world cinema. Political cinema initiated by Dry Summer continued into the 70s, especially through the work of Yılmaz Güney, who led a wave of filmmakers confronting class and state violence with bold realism. This momentum was cut short by 1960 military coup, which brought heavy censorship, silenced dissent, and dismantled opposition cinema in Turkey. In the 1990s, a new wave of Turkish political cinema emerged after the silence imposed by the 1980 coup. These films shifted overt ideology to symbolism, memory, and fragmented identities, often engaging with Kurdish issue in subtle but powerful ways. Yeşim Üstoğlu's Journey of the Sun reflects this shift. It tells the story of Mehmet, a man wrongly assumed to be Kurdish due to his appearance, who become entangled in the reality of ethnic discrimination and state violence. Through his friendship with Basin, a young Kurdish activist, the film traces a deeply personal confrontation with the consequences of marginalization. Water, while not essential to the plot, serves as a recurring symbol element tied to grief, transformation, and belonging. The opening and closing scenes, which mirror each other through a coffin reflected in water, frame the story with ambiguity and emotional depth. In the final act, when Mehmet realizes Berzan's coffin releases Balance coffin into the flooded Kurdish village of Lorduş, water becomes a grave, a border, and a witness to cultural erasure. As Asuhan Suner notes, water here marks an absent presence. It holds what has been lost but not forgotten. In Journey to the Sun, the Kurdish struggle is not directly spoken, but etched into bodies, landscapes, and flow of water. In contemporary Turkish cinema, water has re-emerged as a powerful signifier, both in its material role within power struggles and as a symbolic force that challenges authority. It no longer functions merely as a background or metaphor, but as a site where ecological, political, and moral conflicts converge. A striking example of this is Burning Days, a 2022 film that places water at the very heart of this narrative. Set in a parched Anatolian town, plagued by sinkholes and corruption, the story unfolds around a young prosecutor confronting a corrupt local elite, environmental devastation, and institutional decay. Burning Day follows a newly appointed prosecutor in a small Anatolian town as he navigates a web of political tension, ecological crisis, and moral ambiguity. With local elections approaching, a severe drought, and appearance of sinkholes which caused by the mayor's exploitation of underground water for votes, set the stage for disturbing rape case involving the mayor's son. As the prosecutor becomes entangled in these events, the film traces his struggle not only to uncover the truth, but simply to survive. The film Burning Days opens with Emre and Judge Zeynep standing at the edge of massive sinkhole, a haunting void that immediately carries symbolic weight. While geological and on the surface, the sinkhole becomes an allegory for Turkey's unstable political and ideological terrain. As Althusser suggests, ideology reproduces itself through cycles and state issues. The collapsing circular form of the sinkhole mirrors the cycle of collapse and containment. Burning Days isn't alone in using sinkholes symbolically. Recent Turkish films increasingly use to represent political and existential decay, marking a shift from older symbols like wells or pits to more uncontainable images of disappearance. Here, water plays a crucial, though implicit role. The sinkholes are caused by excessive groundwater extraction, a little case of natural resources being exploited for power, ultimately undermining social stability. This geological collapse parallels the town's political decay, where surface-level traditions hide deeper coercive structures. Following the scene, the prosecutor, Emre's conversation with Judge Zeynep, reveals how power circulates through informal rituals. The judge encourages him to join mayor's dinners, calling it a local custom. But as Birdie reminds us, such gestures carry symbolic capital. They reinforce hierarchies and bind individuals into existing power structures. Later, the prosecutor drives past a campaign vehicle promoting mayors while students queue for water in the background. This visual juxtaposition foregrounds the relationship between resource control and political dominance. As Foucault argues, in his analysis of biopolitics, power increasingly operates through the relation of life itself, where access to basic needs like water becomes a mechanism of governance. Here, drought is not just a case, it's means of control. Emre later visits the lake. This shifts the register from Emre's later visit to the lake shifts the register from structural violence to inner disorientation. As he wades into water, the lake's dark, unstable ground evokes what Bachelor calls violent water, a force that unsettles human will and reveals one's vulnerability before nature. In this moment, water no longer signifies only political control, but also psychological isolation of an existential threat. This scene is quietly survived by local journalist Murat, who stands above Emre on a hill. His warning about the lake's dangers is not only practical, it's a subtle act of territorial policing, reminding Emre that in this town, even nature is under watch. This layered encounter reminds us that power operates not only through law or violence, but also through knowledge, visibility, and symbolic space. One of the clearest intersections of water and power occurred during Mayor's Vineyard dinner. True presented as a warm welcome, the real aim is to displeasure the prosecutor Emre into endorsing the mayor's claim that sinkholes have nothing to do with the groundwater project. The mayor reframes environmental concerns as personal attacks, claiming critics just as want the project to fail. This echoes Carl Schmitt's idea of friend-enemy distinction, where dissent is tolerated but seen as betrayal. In today's Turkey, such framing turns opposition into treason, moralizing power over natural resources. That night, a disturbing scene unfolds. Emre, semi-conscious from alcohol, sees Şahin and his friend dancing half naked with pekmez, a young Romani girl. Şahin sprays water from a garden hose over them all, seemingly playful but deeply symbolic. In a town suffering water scarcity, this carefree use of water signals privilege and impunity. More disturbingly, the water becomes a gendered tool of control, used to mark and objectify pekmez. This moment reflects the structural vulnerability of women, especially marginalized ones, in male-dominated spaces. The next morning, Emre learns pekmez was raped. From this point, the film follows his pursuit for justice, not only for her, but also town's environmental and moral collapse. As the investigation unfolds, Emre's inability to remember the night clearly becomes a weapon used against him by Şahin and his allies. Emre begins to question whether he might have been involved, but the only person who can confirm his whereabouts is Murat, the local journalist. Murat, however, is the only public critic of the Mayor's underground water project, making him a political threat as well. In response, both Emre and Murat become targets for rumors suggesting a homosexual relationship. The only scene that hints at this is a memory flashback. Emre recalls Murat undressing and bathing him in the shower. This scene showcases water's resistance against binaries, but also this intimate moment, through a hydrofeminist lens, becomes a scene of care, vulnerability, and bodily interdependence. Drawing on Astrid and Neimani's hydrofeminism, water here not just cleansing, it's a medium of shared embodiment, a way of tending to another through fluid open relations. Eventually, the rumors and rising tension erupt into a fight between Emre and Murat by the lake. Here, water returns, no longer gentle, but as confrontation. Yet the lake becomes a liminal space, holding both conflict and reconciliation. Just as hydrofeminism emphasizes fluid subjectivity, this scene shows that resolution doesn't come through certainty, but through embodied negotiation with waters and unstable terrain. Even though the conflict between Murat and Emre is resolved, the hostility of townspeople toward them has reached an irreversible point. What began with empty water jugs being placed at the prosecutor's door escalates by the end of the film, into both Murat and Emre being scapegoated and chased out of the town. The act of scapegoating functions as a critical allegorical mechanism that exposes the structural dynamics of exclusion ideological projection, deriving on René Girard's terror of the scapegoat, which emphasizes how communities transfer internal tensions onto a chosen individual or group to restore a false sense of order. The film portrays Murat and Emre as victims of such a symbolic displacement. As Şahin and his friends return from a trip, they spot Emre and Murat fleeing from the townspeople by car in the dark of night. They immediately join the chase with their vehicles. Emre and Murat, fleeing on foot after being blocked by the mob, are chased into the night by armed men returning from a hunting trip. The tensions whiz through urgent drumbeats as the hunters push deeper into darkness. Then suddenly, their pursuit is stopped, not by resistance from Emre and Murat, but by the earth itself. They arrive at the edge of an enormous sinkhole. The sinkhole here is not just a background feature, it physically interrupts the spatial and social order. The hunters, up to this point embodying the town's violent collective will, find themselves confused, disoriented, and unable to proceed. On the opposite side of the abyss, Emre and Murat appear still, illuminated, and unreachable. At this moment, the balance of power shifts, not through confrontation, but through the unpredictable behavior of water-altered land. The sinkhole is a material consequence of the mayor's unchecked exploitation of underground water. But instead of serving as a passive landscape, the terrain reconfigures the power relations, halting violence and reasserting limits on human control. This moment also echoes Foucault's idea of power is not fixed, but fluid, constantly shaped by conflict, resistance, and contingency. The sinkhole interrupts the hunter's trajectory, not because of a strategic counterattack, but because the physical environment, degraded through political ambition, has turned against them. Nature, having been instrumentalized by politics, now enforces its own conditions. A town where water has been hoarded, resurrected, and politicized. This moment suggests that the non-human world also holds power to interrupt, delay, possibly reroute human narratives. In closing, Burning Days marks a new stage in political representation of water in Turkish cinema. Here, water is not just a setting or a symbol. It's where the conflict unfolds. It's a resource hoarded by elites, a weapon used in the act of gendered violence, and ultimately, a natural force that breaks through the illusion of human control. Contemporary Turkish cinema has reached a point where ecological imagery, especially water, carries the weight of political critique. It reflects a shift from earlier metaphorical uses of water toward urgent, embodied, and systemic depictions. In Burning Days, water is everywhere, absent in taps, sprayed onto the powerless, and collapsing the land itself. It challenges not just the characters, but the very structures of domination they navigate. This is where the politics of water and politics of cinema converge. Both can overflow the boundaries we try to impose on them. And when they do, they make power visible. Thank you.
Thank you, Yahya. I can't wait to look at some of those films later. Okay, finally, we close today's programming with Dr. Oliver Wilson-Nunn, Interscalar Justice, Documentary Responses to the Conflictive Geographies of the Judicialized Matanza-Riachuelo River Basin in Argentina. Oliver Wilson-Nunn is a junior research fellow at Robinson College, University of Cambridge. In 2024, he completed his PhD thesis on the role and representation of the state in Argentine films about imprisonment. His past and forthcoming publications on prison writing, prison-based film, and collaborations between academics and incarcerated peoples have featured in Latin American Research Review, Modern Language Review, Ñawi, Arte, Diseño y Comunicación, Hispanic Research Journal, and Prison Service Journal. His postdoctoral research project explores how documentary filmmakers from Argentina have responded to the law. In particular, he examines films that engage with judicialization in areas ranging from socio-environmental conflict to reproductive justice, the politically contested criminalization of corruption, and human rights violations during the last civic military dictatorship. Let's offer our final warm welcome to Oliver.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kate. And huge thank you to Julie and Sam for organizing this amazing selection of talks. Just a brief note to say that I mistakenly prepared a 20-minute presentation, but I'm going to make sure I cut that down as we go so I keep to time. I just talking about the most important parts. So I'm going to be talking about the Matanza-Riachuelo River Basin in Argentina and kind of the legal conflict surrounding it in the 21st century, focusing specifically on the issue of responsibility. And I'm going to be arguing that critical documentary film practices problematize without kind of simplistically doing away with or opposing official court-based conceptions of responsibility amid socio-environmental conflict. And I'm going to suggest that they do so and they make responsibility a structural issue through space by thinking about how responsibility is embedded in multiple locations, multiple scales, which can range from the transnational to the national to the city walls into the molecular level of the soil. So to get started, there we go. So last year, Argentina's Supreme Court voted to end its supervision of the so-called Mendoza case, concerning the pollution of the Matanza-Riachuelo River Basin in the city and province of Buenos Aires. So amid kind of the current far-right government of Javier Milei, this has been widely criticized as both abandoning the people most affected by pollution of the river and kind of at worst being an example of the court's complicity with the current government. So the kind of formal judicial timeline began in 2004 when people living and working in the marginalized Villa Inflamable neighborhood next to one of the country's largest petrochemical compounds, filed a lawsuit against the national, provincial, and city governments, and that's important, as well as 44 companies, also very important, in response to their long-standing experience of pollution. In 2008, the Supreme Court passed a sentence that made the national, provincial, and city governments, but not the companies, responsible for restoring a healthy environment and preventing future environmental harm. Among kind of some of the key institutional outcomes were the geopolitical creation of the river basin itself as an interjurisdictional administrative space, as well as a public body, ACUMAR, in charge of carrying out an environmental plan of action. Since then, the kind of progress has been markedly checkered with accusations of corruption and claims by people most affected by the pollution and the court case, especially those who were relocated, that they had very little participation in the actual legal proceedings, which had a massive material impact on their day-to-day lives. So the case implicates not only kind of the overwhelmingly marginalized people living in informal settlements by the riverbanks, but a variety of high-profile and wide-reaching historical, spatial, and cultural scales. I'm not going to go through these for questions of time, but just on a general level, this is the basin of the river, which is the area of land drained by the river and its tributaries, houses over 6 million people living in 14 different municipalities. And it's also been, the river's been a massively important part of Argentine culture all throughout the 20th century. These are just some of the cultural productions which kind of engage with the Riachuelo amongst some of the most pervasive narrations of the nation itself, ranging from mass immigration to industrialization, populism, and the decline of the nation amid 1990s neoliberalism. So in more recent years, the river's been kind of increasingly involved with narratives regarding the law. And I'm going to mobilize the term judicialization, which kind of in very general terms is a phenomenon whereby social, environmental, and political conflicts are increasingly taken to courts and sort of embedded in legal language and conflicts. So in terms of water, this typically brings to mind the idea of rights of nature, as rivers in Colombia, Canada, New Zealand, and recently the UK have been granted diverse forms of legal personhood. But that's not the case with the Riachuelo. Here, the rights belong not to nature itself, but to society, as the court responded to the collective right to a healthy environment, which was enshrined in the 1994 Constitution. So kind of in this way, we can think about not just sort of punctual legal changes, but the Riachuelo being part of a broader context of juridification, which is related to kind of the specific changes of judicialization, but refers, following Rachel Cedar, as a term of legal framing, whereby in this broader process, language, culture, and symbols become central to people seeing themselves as legal subjects. And we can think about this kind of as sort of central to Argentine politics, be it to do with the increasing and contested criminalization of corruption or claims of corruption, and kind of emblematically the trials for the military generals responsible for the death and disappearance of over 30,000 people during the last dictatorship between 1976 and 1983, which has been so important both for the country's political identity and increasingly its cultural identity. So judicialization and juridification can help produce concrete changes, but at the same time as they might depoliticize, or kind of perhaps more accurately, situate conflict and violence within very specific sorts of kind of court or legal-centric politics. So what I'm trying to do is ask where documentary filmmaking sits within kind of the ambivalence of both of these processes, of intensified legal action and legal subjectivity. So which aspects of a water-based conflict might become visible through kind of a judicial lens, and which ones might become displaced or obscured? So law and film scholars have kind of long noted that judicial process and documentary cinema share several qualities and sort of even epistemological foundations, ranging from investigative process to kind of the use of expert interviews. And kind of being somewhat cautious of the sort of emancipatory potential of repurposing the master's tools for critique, Fernando Rosenberg asks, can the judicial documentary perhaps present evidence beyond its submission to a legal logic, to invite an experience of the real that, while advancing a critique of a legal apparatus, also hints at a different notion of justice, through but beyond the law? And I'm really interested in this idea of through but beyond the law. So in the case of the Matanza conflict, can we think of a documentary that responds to this case of judicialization, sort of both mobilizing, but perhaps going beyond the terms that's created by the law itself? So I'm going to really be thinking about this in terms of the idea of responsibility. I'm going to be thinking both about a documentary produced by the Supreme Court itself, and kind of saying that it's in many ways symptomatic of its own kind of juridified understanding of responsibility, before putting this in context with a couple of more critical documentaries, one which is to do with, in many ways, the scientific and legal processes surrounding the case, and another which is an eco-feminist short, in many ways a bit more creative. So the short institutional film Riachuelo documentary, produced for the Supreme Court's interactive, publicly available multimedia platform, has a tripartite structure. beginning with the Supreme Court President summarizing the 2004 lawsuit, before an exposition of debates held in court during public hearings between 2006 and 2007, finishing with a summary of the 2008 sentence. Now, responsibility is tackled in the middle section with the public hearings. And here we have a juxtaposition of fervent critiques of industrial contamination with presentations made by legal representatives of large companies, such as Shell, trying to evade any sort of responsibility for pollution. So while kind of cliched judicial narratives of rational impartiality might make us think that kind of in this institutional court-produced documentary, the court itself might be kind of presented as simply a rational, impartial setting for debate. In fact, that's not the case. And the documentary really tries to situate the court and the judges on the sort of more progressive critical side of the argument. And the critical side of this debate is kind of most clearly represented by environmental lawyers, including Andres Napoli, who we see here on the left. In the clip of Napoli, he states, collective environmental damage here has clear and direct culprits, or responsables in Spanish. The authorities, industries, and service activities that operate in the river basin. So responsibility here is both public and private, institutional and corporate. And the documentary affords these lawyers both kind of personality and authority by using these kind of predominantly medium shots in which, accompanied by their full name and institutional affiliations, they sort of charismatically fill the frame. And in the case of the right, we have this really kind of interesting, effective reorganization of even the kind of the space of the court itself, as this sort of critical lawyers made to appear alongside the lawyers rather than against the lawyers. They're not questioning him, they're participating with him in trying to make this issue of responsibility publicly known. In stark contrast, the subsequent claims to corporate innocence are made to appear farcical. Only a few seconds of each statement are shown, edited into kind of a nonsensical montage of poorly substantiated rhetorics of innocence. We kind of have these longer use of depersonalizing long shots, and rather than giving individual names, we simply have this generalizing subtitle of business representatives. In this section, the only person who's named is a judge who sarcastically remarks that all the companies must be angelical. So while the documentary aligns the judges spatially, effectively, and visually with the lawyers who develop these structural critiques of both the state and corporate responsibility, the third section of the film, which kind of summarizes the sentence, occludes any mention of corporate responsibility whatsoever, and it turns solely to the city, national, and provincial governments. Now, as many people have highlighted with this case, including Santiago Canet, one of the two main shortcomings of the judicialization of the Riachuelo, beyond the kind of question of participation, has been this question of responsibility, as the court continues to protect these large transnational corporations with their silence. We might then kind of situate the court and its documentary in dialogue with Maria Jimena González Serrano's argument that the Colombian court's granting of legal rights to the Atrato, Cauca, and Magdalena rivers serves as what she terms ornamental rights, from a court wishing to highlight its progressive jurisprudence while treating the private sector with absolute deference, leaving the legal framework, that is kind of investment law, that allows for capital accumulation completely unaltered. So while the Argentine case is not about the rights of nature, we kind of have this similar flattening out of tensions. We have an innovative court sentence in many ways, which is kind of really importantly thinking about the structural responsibility of authorities and the government for pollution, but in a way which is kind of, in this documentary, foregrounding progressive judicial activism over the economic responsibility of large companies, many of whom are allowed to continue polluting the river. So these tensions are kind of not simply legalistic concerns, but ones that in many ways situate the judicialization of the Matanza-Riachuelo river basin within terms at the very core of Argentine political culture. So responsibility, be it in terms of individuals versus collectives, the state, society, and the private sector, are kind of really core to this debate about how we talk about the last dictatorship in the country between 1976 and 1983. So there's generally a growing consensus that it wasn't simply military, but civil or civic military, given that formerly non-state groups, such as large companies and the church, contributed to the state's genocidal violence. And this has been explored in documentary film through the film Corporate Accountability, which is kind of really interesting sort of a detective documentary road movie in which Jonathan Perel drives around the country filming factories of these large companies, such as Ford, that contributed to repression during these years. And I kind of really want to think about this idea of Perel's film kind of almost as a cartography of corporate responsibility, as a framework for thinking about how films, kind of more critical films about the Riachuelo, pluralize space, they kind of map out responsibility to build models of responsibility that are more complex and attentive to social, economic, and political tensions, rather than that made by the court's own sort of court-centric documentary. So the final scene of the 2018 eco-feminist short film Women of the River reflects explicitly on the issue of responsibility. So alongside the filmmaker and a teacher from a polluted neighborhood, Beatriz Mendoza, who we see on the right, who's the woman after which the court case was named, says that Akumar, which is the organism created by the court to carry out the sentence, is, I quote, taking the piss, by saying that this can be solved through education, since you've got to teach people not to throw rubbish in the river. They're telling us that we, as individuals, are causing the problem. Against this kind of individualizing model of responsibility, the documentary kind of organizes urban space in such a way that foregrounds the responsibility of both individual companies and the structural fabric within which they're working, kind of resonating with this call for a sort of legal-centric individualizing or responsibilizing justice, but one which also moves beyond it. There's also a political economic as well as kind of more accusatory logic. So early on, Beatriz Mendoza explains in Voice Off how the sentence led to really important health-based infrastructure, which we see here on the top left. But with no break in sound, the image cuts to a shot of a nearby street in which a Shell oil truck passes through both silently and speedily without any sort of comment. So in many ways, I think the scene spatializes a kind of a judicialized form of what Marxist geographer David Harvey might call a spatial fix, as states, corporations, and here the court externalize or build away the ongoing internal contradictions of capitalist accumulation, sort of as stopgap solutions. Now, interestingly, while the kind of Shell truck initially fills the frame, it moves away to reveal a mural painted on the chemical compound itself. This is a sort of multi-scalar mural created by the local community, and it really foregrounds the multiple scales which are involved. It's not just about them, it's about the city, it's about international corporations, it's about the governmental agencies themselves. So kind of the film reorganizes space to contradict these abstract institutional discourses of individual responsibility that sort of in many ways flatten the spatio-temporal tensions between transnational capital, court-mandated infrastructure, and community action. So to finish with, I'm going to be looking at Sergio Chiosone's film, The Return to the River, which has in many ways a more rural focus, sort of in a much less mediatized version of the river basin. And I'm going to suggest that it proposes a more future-facing, non-anthropocentric vision of what responsibility might look like. In this particular section of the film that I have here, an ecologist from the local university emphasizes that two lakes, the Santa Catalina and Rocha lakes, have natural purifying qualities on the groundwater. He goes on to speculate towards a sort of hydrologically balanced future, that if we can imagine that starting today, we stop supplying sources of pollution to the Riachuelo River, based on the power of nature, in the long term, we could achieve balance. And what I think is really interesting here is that the film kind of moves towards these kind of intimate close-ups, which really focuses on the level of the plants themselves, against the kind of earlier focus on the use of sort of photography as proof, these spectacular long shots earlier in the film. And there's kind of this really interesting idea that doing so would be moving away from the kind of this punitive logic. In doing this, we don't have to think of this as a sort of punishment, but think of it as a challenge. And there's in this way, this kind of idea that a more balanced future in which there's a move away from this mass scale industrial politics could be something which is less legally centered. It's less punitive. It's about a different way of thinking of these concerns, which move beyond the legal. There's this engagement with the molecular level of soil and plants in a way which is kind of interlapped with the grand scale of the nation and the industrial. So just to finish off with, I just want to briefly put this in context with a very famous short story by the well-known Argentine author Mariana Enriquez, who in one of her very famous short stories called Beneath the Black Water, there's this kind of very specific moment about the Riachuelo. And it's not about this specific court case, but they talk about all the rubbish that's thrown into the river. And one of the priests involved says, bah, I used to think that that this rotten river was part of our idiosyncrasy, a country of irresponsible people. But now I think differently. All those who polluted this river were very responsible. And so in this way, I'm kind of thinking about the different ways in which different scales, be it of particular individuals, nations, transnational corporations, are involved with different types and different intensities of responsibility. So these films can help us to think not anti-institutionally, but critically about the law in a country where the judiciary and legal logics are central to the kind of the fractious relationship between state and society. And I'll leave it there.
Lovely. Thank you to Oliver. Thank you to all our speakers and to you all as engaged audience members. We will now open up the Zoom room floor to audience questions. Please use the raise hand function to ask questions. If anyone is unable to do this, feel free to just come off mute and speak if tech is not working, or you can also continue to put questions in the chat and I will read them aloud. Is there anyone that would like to start?